Hello, everyone. We've got a really exciting event today. I'm here with Arch Hades, an artist and best-selling poet from London who became the highest-paid living poet in the world in 2021. She's the author of 4 volumes of poetry, High Tide, Fool's Gold, Paper Romance, and Arcadia, known best for romantic lyricism and for exploring poetry and philosophy in a traditional rhyming style. In 2021, Arch's most recent book, Arcadia, was sold as digital artwork at Christie's New York, where it broke records as the most expensive poem ever sold at $525,000. Arch often writes commentary for national newspapers and gives talks on philosophy, art, and cultural discourse at universities such as Oxford and UCL. And she's here to talk with us today about Arcadia and existentialism, as well as to answer a few questions from myself and the audience. Without further ado, Arch Hades.
So, hello. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for having me. Yes, as mentioned, I'm here to talk about existentialism, so I don't know how much you guys know about that already. I'm assuming quite a bit because this is Cambridge, and you do your reading. But the message is a very simple one. Get ready to die, because you will. In the words of Albert Camus, there is only one serious philosophical question, and that is suicide. Even though that's phrased somewhat sensationally, the man had books to sell, don't we all? He was really encouraging us to choose life, and to choose it actively, not just exist passively. Because once you do, the next big questions that come are, how do I live? What should I do? What should any of us be doing? Professor Walter Kaufmann, who not only translated the existentialist texts that I will be referring to, he was also the chair of philosophy at Princeton University until his death in 1980, which is the same year as Jean-Paul Sartre died. Professor Kaufmann would disagree with a lot of things that I'm about to say, and his criticisms are very valid. He would say that existentialism isn't really a philosophy. He would say that existentialism cannot be boiled down to specific tenets. He would argue that existentialism should be dropped as a label in itself. And in a way, he would be right. It can indeed be argued that existentialism is not a philosophy, but a label for several widely different revolts against traditional philosophy. The essence of this movement is the refusal to belong to any school of thought, the repudiation of the adequacy of any body of beliefs whatever, and especially of systems, and a marked dissatisfaction with academic philosophy as superficial, abstract, and remote from life. This evergreen notion of rebellion is at the heart of existentialism, that and dressing in all black. Kaufmann is right in that existentialism began with rebellion, specifically the rebellion of Soren Kierkegaard against Hegel in the early 19th century. Hegel's philosophy explained the world evolving dialectically through successions of forms of consciousness, each stage superseding the one before until they all rise up sublimely in what he calls the absolute spirit. So Hegel's phenomenology of spirit leads us to this apex as grand as that of the biblical book of Revelation. But instead of ending with everyone divided between heaven and hell, Hegel's spirit subsumes us into cosmic consciousness. I promise you that's the last of Hegel. I'm not his biggest fan. Soren Kierkegaard had a problem with Hegel's theories. He countered Hegel by asking, what if I don't choose to be a part of this absolute spirit? What if I refuse to be absorbed? What if I just want to be me? Kierkegaard was no stranger to questioning and criticizing authority, from politicians to the media to, especially, the religious elites of his time. His focus was on answering a question that weaves throughout his numerous works, how to be human in this world. He created this new philosophical style rooted in suffering, freedom, and the inward drama of being human. And of course, there's drama. The human condition is perfectly absurd. We are in constant conflict between the human tendency to seek out inherent value and meaning in life and the human inability to find any in a purposeless, irrational universe. Copernicus's radical displacement of the human being from the cosmic center was emphatically reinforced and intensified by Darwin's revelation that the human being is in the flux of evolution, no longer divinely ordained, absolute, or secure, rather just one more ephemeral species. This cosmological estrangement of modern consciousness, initiated by Copernicus, and the ontological estrangement initiated by Descartes, were completed by the epistemological estrangement initiated by Kant. We find ourselves in what Professor Richard Tarnas calls the threefold, mutually enforced prison of modern alienation. The human condition is one where we are simultaneously intellectually aroused and psychologically crushed. And on top of that, people are just awful to each other all the time. These existential aches and questions have been around for as long as humans have been around. Back then, they used to distract themselves with religion and Jesus Christ, and today we distract ourselves with TikTok and Harry Styles. Not that that's a shot at Harry Styles in particular, but more at society's cult of celebrity that intensifies our narcissistic dreams of fame and glory, that encourages people to hate normality and ultimately themselves, making it more difficult to accept the ordinary of everyday existence. Unfortunately, Kierkegaard died young when he was only 42, but his line of questioning was picked up by Friedrich Nietzsche, who was only 11 years old when Kierkegaard died. Nietzsche continued pioneering this mood of rebellion and dissatisfaction with traditions. Nietzsche created a new definition of existence as choice, action, self-assertion, and made a study of the anguish and difficulty of life. Nietzsche might as well be called an existentialist. His refusal to belong to any school of thought, his rejection of dogma, his view that traditional philosophers in particular were, he claimed, too often motivated by the wish to justify current moral prejudices of society. But also, Nietzsche's commitment to integrity as the highest value, even though it's independent of social utility, is very existentialist in itself. The value of a human being, Nietzsche said, does not lie in their usefulness, for it would continue to exist even if there were nobody to whom it could be useful. The value of Nietzsche's man is highly complex, while Jean-Paul Sartre's insistence on integrity may seem relatively simple. A closer comparison, however, shows that the features Nietzsche stressed are found in Sartre too, if less explicitly. Passion and its mastery, independence of convention, and the creative freedom which finds ultimate expression in being a law unto itself. Jean-Paul Sartre, who was born 5 years after Nietzsche died, also believed that philosophy is not just a profession. It was life itself, the life of an individual. During fraught conversations at left-bank cafes with, bear with me on the accents, Simone de Beauvoir, Gabriel Marcel, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and Albert Camus, among others, existentialism became an inhabited philosophy. Sartre was the first to attempt to define existentialism during his 1945 lecture, Existentialism is a Humanism. And his definition can be roughly translated to mean existentialism is the philosophy that draws all the consequences from a position of consistent atheism. It's a philosophy that holds freedom and responsibility as the supreme value and authenticity as integrity as primary virtues. There have been many attempts to narrow down the core tenets of existentialism, but most have the following in common. First and foremost, existence precedes essence. First, we discover we exist. Then we try and figure out what we are. We are not born with human nature or essence, since there is no God or higher power to conceive of it. Existentialism is not atheist in the sense that it would exhaust itself in demonstrations of the non-existence of God. And also you can evoke Bertrand Russell's teapot argument that the burden of proof is on the person making empirically unjustifiable claims. Rather, existentialism declares that even if God exists right now, it would make no difference for our point of view. God is a useless and costly hypothesis, so we will do without it. As far as we know, We are all cosmically irrelevant, biological accidents. And on a personal level, I've always found that rather comforting, because there's nothing I'm meant to be doing. And there's no way I can fail at that. And there's nowhere I need to be. I'll choose what I want to do when I feel like it. Existence precedes essence means that we are born free, and then we choose our own values. The first effect of existentialism is to metaphysically strip down every individual and make them conscious that they are solely responsible for themselves. No one is coming for you. No one will save you. No one will even help you. You are responsible for yourself and your life. To be clear, you are not responsible for what others choose to do to you or for the circumstances beyond your control. But you're responsible for what you do with that. Your suffering, your pain, your trauma is never an excuse for bad behavior and irresponsibility. Secondly, freedom is responsibility. That's the second tenet. When you're free to make your choices, you become responsible for their consequences. A person becomes an existential individual if they are free to make their authentic choices. Therefore, it's important not to give in to the pressures of conformity. For this to be actionable, it is vital for us to understand and separate our natural limitations from man-made pressures. For example, the seasons are real because the Earth rotates on a tilted axis, but the 5-day work week isn't. Sunrise, sunset, natural, normal, beyond our control, spending 40 hours a week staring at a screen in an office, not natural, we made it up. So when you discover a rule that is man-made, a pressure that is societal, you must question how it came about and what is its purpose. What are the pros, what are the cons? Sometimes a man-made rule is good, like don't murder. In pretty much every circumstance, bar self-defense, a good rule, so we'll keep it. But some rules, some pressures, are not just nonsensical, they are harmful, they are exploitative. For example, if service and submission were so natural to women, there wouldn't be thousands of sermons every day telling women to service and submit because nature doesn't need reminders to run its course. These messages persist because indoctrination depends on constant reinforcement to keep harmful ideologies alive. Ideally, in an existentialist society, each individual should be provided with enough viable options before they make a decision, because freedom loses value without meaningful choice. But even in extreme situations, sometimes when you are presented with a choice as stark as kill or be killed, you are still responsible for the choice that you make, which is why following orders is, to this day, a war crime. From this tenet blooms social responsibility that urges us to, 1, maximize our freedom and opportunity and choice for everyone, asterisks within reason, and 2, hold people accountable for their choices, especially if one's choices are harmful to another. But ramifications themselves must also be within reason. Therefore, we must consider the ethical consequences of all our choices. If we don't hold people accountable, we are teaching everybody irresponsibility. The third tenet of the philosophy is therefore ethical considerations. Ethical considerations are paramount. As we know, Enlightenment thinking replaces the idea that morality comes from God with the idea that our duty comes from our membership of society. Individuals are left to create their own values because there is no higher moral order in the universe which guides our actions. But our actions not only affect us, but those around us too. So we're not only responsible for ourselves, we are responsible for those around us. This is where Sartre's existentialism describes an individual's life as a kind of template for what everyone else should do too. Whatever you do, you are giving moral permission for others to do the same. For example, if you litter, you're making it morally permissible for others to litter too. Through the choices we make, we paint a picture of what we think a human ought to be like. Not that Sartre was a finger-wagging moralizer. Rather, he insisted that each of us acknowledge what we are doing with our lives right now, what we're wearing, what we're buying, what we're eating, what kinds of professions are we in, what kinds of prejudices do we hold. Because he wanted people to switch from autopilot to greater self-awareness and take responsibility for their actions. Unfortunately, Jean-Paul Sartre did not manage to go into greater detail of his existentialist ethics, and as the years went by, the once friendly philosophical conversations he had at bars and cafes became intellectual battles, and personal feuds between the existentialists fragmented and weakened the cause. An important point to make here is that existentialism does not clearly entail one specific political program. And in fact, leading existentialists followed divergent paths during the Hitler years. Martin Heidegger, who in Being and Time had spoken much of resolutely facing death, joined the Nazi Party after Hitler came to power, alienating his former mentor Edmund Husserl, the Jewish father of phenomenology, and his romantic partner Hannah Arendt, also Jewish, who fled to America for safety. Karl Jaspers, who had a Jewish wife, made the decision to keep quiet. But once the war was over, back in 1945, he was ready to speak again of guilt and shipwreck and dread and death. Jean-Paul Sartre fought against the Nazis, but then was captured very quickly, and then sent back to Paris. In Paris, he joined the resistance and became fast friends with Albert Camus. That's how they met. Unfortunately, years later, he fell out with Camus completely after what he calls making a common front with the French Communist Party, although Sartre frequently denied he was a communist himself. Camus, on the other hand, openly condemned the USSR, believing any totalitarian regime is an enemy of freedom. Over similar topics, Gabriel Marcel feuded with Jean-Paul Sartre, Camus fell out with Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Merleau-Ponty then in turn argued with Sartre, and then Arthur Koestler even managed to punch Camus in the face, giving him a black eye. Personally, I believe it would be much more logically consistent and realistic to build existentialist ethics on top of the political philosophy of John Rawls and his doctrine of justice's fairness, keeping capitalism, but rejecting 21st century hypercapitalism, but regulating it heavily and with a focus on providing financial help to the most disadvantaged through progressive taxation and highly scrutinized fiscal policies. But that's just me. With a souring of these friendships, and inevitably with their deaths in succession, existentialism was largely laid to rest by the 1980s. But the ideas live on. The need for questioning, rebellion, authenticity, responsibility, and most importantly, freedom. What you choose may be difficult and unnerving. And Sartre does not deny that the need to keep making decisions brings constant anxiety. But he heightened that this anxiety points out that what you do matters. Your choices matter. In the 21st century, in developed societies, our struggles with freedom have evolved. Firstly, lack of freedom and choice is no longer the main problem in developed industrialized societies. Now, our collective anxiety lies in our inability to make the most of the freedoms our ancestors painfully secured for us over the last 3 centuries. Faced with an abundance of choices and the fear of error and failure, we often become uncertain to the point of inertia. And why wouldn't you when you have 500 different cereals to pick from? In sum, we have grown anxious without the sufficient wisdom and resources to exploit our liberty. Secondly, Marx claimed that capitalism alienates us from our labor. 21st century hypercapitalism is more sinister because it alienates us from our being by seducing us into ceaseless consumption, relentless self-exposure, and endless self-exploitation that leads us to mental collapse. It's insidious because when we burn out, when we realize there's no deeper meaning to our production and consumption, we blame ourselves. And we feel ashamed because we feel we failed in the hustle culture we volunteered into. Hypercapitalism does not overtly suppress our freedom, but instead it exploits it. It is precisely this felt freedom that makes protest and change hard. Our self-harm is accompanied by a feeling of freedom. We're constantly asked, encouraged, pressured, but never forced, to share our opinions and preferences and needs, to document our life story. This data then becomes the object of ruthless commercial exploitation by techno-oligarchies that use it to predict and manipulate our behavior. We live under a digital feudalism. Our digital feudal lords give us free land ourselves and then tell us to cultivate it, and we do exhaustively. Then our feudal lords return for the harvest, surveillance, and exploitation of all communication, and the system works so efficiently. No one protests against it because the system exploits freedom and self. We participate freely, and what's more, it feels good when we do it well. And when we don't get the likes and the retweets, we feel awful, and we try harder. We are controlled like puppets on algorithmic strings, all while feeling free. But this freedom is really serfdom. Big data heralds the end of free will. The future can be calculated and thus manipulated. Big data is not only used for surveillance, but most of all for controlling human behavior. China has created a digital disciplinary society. It has a social scoring system that makes possible the complete biopolitical surveillance and control of the population. No aspect of everyday life remains unobserved. Each click, purchase, contact, activity on social media is subject to surveillance. There are over 200 million surveillance cameras with facial recognition technology in operation right now. Those who drive through a red light, meet up with people who oppose the regime, or post critical comments on social media live dangerously. But those who buy healthy foods, read newspapers loyal to the party, are rewarded with easy credit, cheaper health insurance, and travel permits. Such comprehensive surveillance is possible in China because internet and mobile phones provide and pass all of their data onto the authorities. The state knows where you are, who you're meeting, what you're doing, what you're looking for, what you're buying, what you're eating, what you're thinking. Freedom is always important. In the 21st century, we find ourselves surveyed and managed to an extraordinary degree. Farmed for our personal data, fed consumer goods, but discouraged from speaking our minds or doing anything too disruptive in the world. Freedom has always been important, and talking about it politically also means talking about it in our personal lives. I hope existentialism, its values, will once again provide us with a fresh way of thinking, being, and acting. It may not provide a framework for finding easy answers and solutions to all the problems facing the modern world, but what it can provide are the tools with which to make our own judgments. It encourages in all people the capacity to evaluate and interpret the world. Otherwise, there is little hope of changing it for the better. So get ready to die, because you will. Until then, rebel freely, live responsibly. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. So I'm going to go on to asking a couple questions before bringing it to the audience. I'd like to start first by talking about your newest edition of poetry, which is Arcadia. And you kind of discuss similar themes to what you've just discussed in your speech, one of which is kind of this widespread feeling of burnout, loneliness, and mental illnesses such as depression and anxiety. Have you had any personal experiences with these?
Such a great question. Let me just write them down. Burnout, loneliness. What else?
And mental illnesses such as depression and anxiety. I know this is something you talk about quite a bit. So
It's a great list. It's a great list. Mental illness.
just mental
Anxiety.
illness.
Just mental
Just the whole
illness.
thing.
Yeah, hands up everyone for mental illness and depression. Great. I'll try and go through these. But you're right, I do address these a lot in my own works. And what I just spoke about right now, that's very much the focus of the latest book, Arcadia. Let's go through the list. Burnout.
Such a lecture. I love it. Just every single.
Great.
Yeah.
No, I hope people are thinking about their own burnout right now and all their mental illnesses. That's right. No. I think it's good to talk about these things aloud and to sort of break any stigma around it, which I hope there isn't anymore. Come on, it's 2022. So burnout. I feel I've had burnout only really twice in my life, pretty bad. The first time was professional burnout. So before I became a poet professionally, actually, I used to work a lot in politics. I think very much like you, I did my politics degree, and then I basically went off to the various corridors of power amongst Westminster, and I was working in politics for a good couple of years. I think maybe 5, maybe 6, but because it's politics, it feels like forever, right? So the first burnout I really had was when there was just too many elections all at once. And that really burns you out because you have to be in the office at 5:45 a.m. every single day because the first headlines come out at 6. And then you finish only, goodness, maybe 11, maybe midnight. Sometimes you actually sleep in the office or they hire out a hotel close to the office so you can basically stay there. That was, I got very burned out there. When you're working sort of 60, 70-hour weeks, you're emotionally exhausted because you have to be switched on all the time. The amount of intellectual challenges are exhausting too. Very exciting. I have no regrets. I had a very good time, but yes, you're physically, mentally, emotionally just exhausted. I got very burnt out then. I remember giving in my notice and I just went on holiday for a month. Amazing. The second time I had burnout was for personal reasons. And I think this still qualifies as burnout, even though it wasn't professional. But this is years ago now, but I got into a relationship with a very toxic narcissist, which took me a while to sort of understand. But my goodness, that was absolutely exhausting because your day is ruined by 8 a.m. sharp, every day. And physically, you're so tired from just crying all the time. That was really bad burnout too. Emotionally, physically exhausting. And after that, I had to take another month of holiday. And that was very good. So I hope not to feel any of those burnouts ever again, because it was exhausting because me time isn't even enough. Going for a couple of days on holiday, it's not enough because with professional burnout, you're resting just so you can be productive later. Even rest becomes functional, a slave to productivity.
Yeah.
So I'm very happy with my new career and I'm very happy with all the people in my life right now. So I hope not to experience either of those burnouts ever again. Loneliness is a very interesting word. There's a professor in Norway called Professor Lars Svensson. I actually also reference him in Arcadia. He is the only professor who I think defined loneliness in a very effective way, because there are so many different definitions of loneliness. He defines loneliness as the unfulfilled ideal of connection and belonging. Because I think a lot of loneliness comes from bad expectation management. When your outstretched hands aren't met with the attention that you want, with the attention that you expect from a certain person or a certain group of people, from your friends. Loneliness doesn't have to be just romantic. You can have this unfulfilled ideal of connection and belonging from your parents, from your family, from your peer groups. And so his book is called Philosophy of Loneliness. I would really recommend it. I definitely, the loneliest I've ever felt in my life was when I first moved to this country, when I didn't speak the language. And that was really rock bottom for me, because I moved here without my parents, without any friends, but more importantly, without language. I didn't really become fluent in English until I was about 15. And that was the hardest part because you don't have the tools, the means to connect with anyone. So you just feel like a stranger in silence. I've never felt such intense loneliness before, but I haven't felt it since. You find your friends, you find your peers, you find your mentors, you find people who you can connect with, you find people who you feel understood around. Your ideal of connection and belonging does get fulfilled. And what's very important, I feel like in the 21st century, we have so much pressure and expectations on romantic relationships. I think there's so much pressure to find this one person to somehow complete you. And I feel like that's so wrong on so many levels, because first of all, like that sets insane expectations for your partner to fulfill you and make you happy and pay attention to you all the time. That's not fair on them, and also it's not fair it's not fair to you either, because that person will not be around all the time. What if they just die? Again, get ready to die, because you will. It's the only inevitability. And somewhat ironically, a way to conquer your loneliness is to basically sublimate it into solitude. You have to learn how to be alone. That's the only thing. Romantic relationships won't solve your loneliness. You have to understand how to be alone first. And even though it sounds somewhat scary, if you fear being alone with your own thoughts, that's exactly what you should go and do. What you fear most, you should just go and do it. This doesn't apply to things that can actually kill you, like sharks. Don't do that, stay away from them. But if you fear being by yourself, that's exactly what you should do, because you realize actually it's fine after a while. Your thoughts are fine. You'll find your hobbies, you'll find your passions, you'll find whatever it is that you want to be doing, and you go and do it, and you realize that you don't have to be dependent on anyone else, which is good, because people will let you down. And you have to be okay with that. Mental illness. So I've had clinical depression since like 2003 for like almost like 20 years. Oh, mazel, for like almost 20 years now. And that mostly accumulates with depression. Not so much anxiety. I've only ever felt anxiety sort of twice in my life, which I feel pretty lucky with, because I have a lot of friends who do have anxiety, and that just seems like a waking nightmare for them. Depression is a strange one, because back in sort of the early 2000s, people just didn't really believe you. I feel like we've made a lot of very good strides towards accepting the condition, different kinds of treatments. Therapy has come such a long way. My goodness, back in 2003, like when I first started getting therapy for it, it felt very unproductive. Perhaps I just had a very bad personal experience that just may be what it is. But it was, especially when you're sort of like, when you're a teenager, especially when you're maybe struggling with the language like I was, it's very difficult to explain why you're sad, because that's what people thought that it was. They just thought that like, oh, you're just sad. You're just sad because you have no friends. Well, that's a part of it, sure. But sadness is not something to be medicated away. I think certain medications can help you regain your calm, regain your sense, but unfortunately, it's not a long-term solution. And even now, there's so much evidence coming out against like SSRIs actually saying that they don't actually help you produce the serotonin that you need. Like, it's good that there's much more scientific discovery, and there's still much more experiments, and there's much more knowledge to be gained from that. I'm very happy about that, but just I would say be careful with medications. Sometimes it can really, really help people. I feel like I've been through enough to know that it doesn't work for me. I just need to get to my own state of calm, which I feel like now I have, because I've been living with it for such a long time. I feel like I can manage it very, very well. But you have to be surrounded with the right people. And I think that's what really helped me. I don't know if anyone sort of suffers through their own depression every now and again. By the way, you will, like at least half of you will experience depression at some point in your life. So again, get ready for that, because that's going to be a ride. It's really important to surround yourself with people with the right attitude. I remember when I first started trying to communicate with sort of with like my family about it and my therapist at the time, and their attitude was, well, there's something wrong with you, have some pills to numb your brain, which was a really unproductive for me until I met somebody who, when they were 16, I was 15 at the time, and she was the first person to ever tell me that actually, no, there's nothing wrong with you. This is a perfectly normal reaction to what's going on in the world and what's happening to you. And because she made me feel okay about it, it almost solved it almost immediately. So surround yourself with people who want to understand you and who want to be there for you. Even just talking about it can make a huge difference to your own mental health as well. But understand that you still, like, you're a brain in a flesh prison. You have to exercise your body, go outside. I know this sounds stupid, but you have to give yourself like all the fighting chances. Eat the right foods. Like, you are what you eat. Like, eat nutritious things. Give yourself the best chance. Like, try and sleep. Do these things for your body. Like, you are still, unfortunately, you're still a mammal in this flesh prison. Look after it too, and it will look after your brain as well. I think in the 21st century, depression, once again, kind of what I felt in my sort of earlier life. I think it's quite an accurate reaction to the world around us. You know, the oceans are perpetually on fire, and the old Twitter villains are back. It's hard. It's hard right now. Do your best. Look after yourself.
Yeah, so on that point, this kind of storyline that Arcadia goes through it starts with this hopelessness and anxiety, but then you kind of talk about healing through nature and living for yourself. How has nature and self-autonomy helped you to kind of deal with this? And also, you know, would that be kind of what you would prescribe to everyone to cure this collective ailment? Or do you think there's kind of more structural change that needs to happen?
Well, I think that's a great question. And, well, ideally we all go on strike collectively. But I'm not sure that's a very realistic solution. And I'm no leader myself. There's somebody far more charismatic and likable out there who can be your leader, and I'll just maybe be their sort of special advisor for a little bit. So I wish there was a way to quickly and effectively reform our systems in a peaceful protest kind of way. And I do hope to see that, but I understand that may not be particularly realistic at the moment. But hey, fingers crossed, maybe mass rebellion, who knows? I'm up for it. Nature is definitely a huge part of my own journey. The whole book, the book is called Arcadia, which, Arcadia literally means that, like, lovely, ideal place of pasture and greenery, which is where I sort of found my own personal solitude. Solitude is, honestly, solves all my problems. I don't really like going outside in public so much. This is like the fourth time this entire year I'm like with other people, and it's great. I want to be here. This is great, but it's I much prefer to just walk around and in the forest where the trees are. They're better company. They're great. I understand that sort of where I normally live in London. Very, very easy for me to just sit here and be like, go outside, eat kale. But I understand that's not realistic for a lot of people. Do your best to get outside, because nature is so universally magnificent. It's so much bigger than you, and it doesn't care about you. It reminds you how irrelevant you are. Your problems aren't real problems on a cosmic scale. You could blow up the Earth and it wouldn't really matter cosmically because there's a billion other stars. It reminds you to shrink your ego. It reminds you that there are things as magnificent and complex as you out there in nature. I would really recommend Beauty by Roger Scruton. I like his stuff on aesthetics. It really calms me when I read his texts, when he talks about the complexity of a flower unfurling or the magnificence of a bird's wing. And I think to myself, God, it's so great that these things exist. There is so much wonderful out there patiently waiting for our notice. it's out there and it's very calming. I think it's a very good step. I would encourage people to find their own solitude in a state of Arcadia.
I want to switch slightly to kind of discussing more about the poetry that you've written, especially with Arcadia. What inspired you to use the 648-line rhyming narrative structure that you used for it?
Yes, great question. I'm a little insecure in my own field, so I always take my cues from the poets that I really like, which are, again, harking back to Arcadia, the English Romantics, capital R. So like Byron, Shelley, Wordsworth, Coleridge. And I like the structures that they use. I think poetry is wonderful when there's a meter and a rhyme. Not that I'm like a huge traditionalist. I think it's just, I'm just not talented enough to be a modernist poet. I like also making a little word Sudoku puzzle out of rhyming poetry. So it's very much just like a very personal preference. And because I think I really grew up reading a lot of Byron, so for example, like Childe Harold, he used quite like a similar sort of like rhyming structure. And, The Eve of St. Agnes by John Keats, for example. Those are the poems that I so enjoyed when I was growing up. So I guess I just wanted to emulate that, which is why I tried to roughly follow a similar-ish structure of rhyming meter in the 648 lines of Arcadia, which is split into 5 cantos, so it's not that boring. There's breaks there.
Yeah, I mean, you say you're not talented. That's absolutely not true at all. I loved Arcadia. I really loved it. I feel like all artists are so insecure about their art. I think everything's amazing, but I'm not an artist at all, so I have no idea about these sorts of things. I'm not good at poetry either.
Francis Bacon shredded most of his works.
Yeah.
I don't know.
What a shame.
Maybe everyone has imposter syndrome apart from Matt Hancock.
So kind of on the same note about your poetry, over the course of your career, your art has shifted from being largely about experiences with romantic relationships, like the one you mentioned before, to kind of these wider societal ills as you see in Arcadia. What motivated this shift for you from the personal to the political in your work?
That's a very good question. Once again, I'm afraid the answer might be a little bit boring. I started out with sort of romantic poetry because love is the grandest of all poetic themes. And I was so inspired by, again, my favorites like Lord Byron and Keats, who wrote the most beautiful, delicate, but universally applicable poetry about their own sort of heartaches, but also the euphoric joy that they felt for their own loved ones too. And again, I just wanted to emulate that myself. And a lot of poets do start out writing sort of about their own personal experiences. It's very difficult to question the validity of someone's romantic feelings. So you don't tend to receive a lot of criticism for that. You can just do it and you can feel sort of happy and secure in that because it's your own feelings. It's very subjective. You can't get a lot of scrutiny and criticism for that. You feel how you feel. So I guess I sort of did that with the first 3 books. Also, in my 20s, I was going through a lot. A lot was happening. And I just kind of needed to sort of write it all down as well. That was very therapeutic for me, which I think also a lot of artists do too. I think it's very therapeutic for them to express their own feelings so they can decipher them more, so they can distill their own emotions. And then hopefully if a book or an artwork does well, it's because they have struck some kind of universal chord that everyone else can hear. And it's personal for them as well. So I think that's a very good sign of success there. And then sort of later on, when I wrote Arcadia, I guess I just really wanted to express something that I feel very passionate about, which is existentialism. And Arcadia is this ode to everything that I spoke about earlier. But also at the same time, I wrote Arcadia quite recently, the pandemic has really revealed that our systems are so fragile, and actually, our governing class is just shambles. And I couldn't understand how not everybody was as angry as I was and as frustrated as I was. We have wasted billions of pounds on COVID-related fraud or even PPE that we can't even use. We literally have to burn £6 billion on PPE that we can't use. I'm so angry that it was revealed that the most like essential workers are the ones that we look down upon, like sanitary workers and like sorry, I forgot the word. People who, like refuse collectors, thank you, refuse collectors and nurses, people who we don't regard highly because they're on low pay, but they're the most essential people in our society, and society collapses without them. Not without hedge fund managers or CEOs. If society will be fine without them. Where are they going to go? David Graeber wrote Bullshit Jobs, and I really recommend everyone read that because it was fantastic. Unfortunately,
I love Bullshit Jobs.
Yes, thank you.
So good.
It's so good. I also referenced it in Arcadia as well. He makes this excellent point, which pretty much I'm summing up terribly, as you can tell. But that these people who we regard so highly and reward with so much financial gain and monetary glory, like hedge fund managers. Thank you. English is my second language. And CEOs and all these billionaires who just shoot themselves into space for what? If they go, how is society going to change? But if we can't afford to pay our train conductors, refuse collectors, and nurses, society will ground to a halt very quickly. So I think we need to reevaluate how we think about these people, how we reward them, and how we reward the others. David Graeber, who unfortunately himself died during the pandemic of COVID complications.
I really like Bullshit Jobs. I think it was one of my favorite things that I'd read in second year, so I definitely agree with you on that. I realized that since we started a little bit late, I just want to let people who haven't had the opportunity to ask questions just in case they need to leave after. But I think we'll go to 1:15 anyway, but I just wanted to give the opportunity for some audience members to ask some questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand.
Hi, I also sort of fancy myself a bit of a poet, trying to be a poet, but is it okay if I ask like 2 questions?
Oh, of course.
Okay. First of all, I've sort of been struggling to like articulate a place for literature in sort of contemporary society, and like, can it create a meaning where there really doesn't seem to be one, or at least suggest or create a sense of empathy and understanding? And also, you talked a bit about imposter syndrome, and I've heard it said from other poets that the best way to get out there and be seen and be published is to just send out your work. But how do you deal with how do you just stop and say, this is good enough to send out, this is good enough for people to see?
Oof. Okay. So sorry. So your first question is more about just so that I understood you correctly. Is it more about sort of like trying to create like a space for literature because you feel like it's sort of, especially the medium of poetry, it's undervalued in our society? Is that it? Sorry. Do correct me because I'm not. I'm definitely not the smartest person in any room. So. To be honest, I think you're right. I think once again, like it's so easy to distract yourself, like mindlessly scrolling through, like Reels or Twitter, etc. But I think there's always a space for literature. I think there's always space for good ideas. I think there's always space for empathy. My goodness, if anything, we need more empathy. Poetry, I've always found, is a very good medium. Because I've always found poetry is a vehicle for emotions. It's a vehicle for self-expression. It's a vehicle for better understanding as well. So because I try and read as much poetry myself as possible, not all the time I find myself completely relating to their point of view, but at least I understand that there is another point of view. At least I understand like, oh, well, that's a different perspective. That's interesting. It widens my own perspective to understand that like somebody can be going through this, somebody can be thinking about that. I think there's always room for it, and I think you should always be trying to distill your own feelings and express whatever you're going through yourself, because it's amazing how many people out there can relate to what you're doing too, even if it seems like you're sort of suffocating within your own loneliness or grief. These are actually the most universal emotions. And there are so many people out there who will connect with your work. So, you know, if you're a poet yourself, first of all, it frustrates when people are like, oh, maybe I don't know if I'm a poet. Of course you are. If you're writing poetry, you're a poet. That's exactly what a poet does. You don't have to be published. You don't have to have, a lot of readers. You're a poet. You're writing poetry. That's it. You're a poet. That's it. And to be honest, good is so subjective. Like, what is good? What is good poetry? I mean, like, I think half of everything I wrote is total garbage. It's hard to know when something you think is good enough, because often I think that like our standards for ourselves are so high, they're often unattainable. I think what's always quite good is I have a best friend who she's kind of my sounding board. And I always find that like if something is interesting enough for her, it doesn't have to be good. I think it just has to be interesting. If she goes, that's interesting, that to me is an indication that like, oh, it must be good enough. And then I can send it off to my editor. So she's a good litmus test for me. And she doesn't even read that much poetry, which I think is also a very good litmus test, because poetry, it's such a niche genre that it's good to test out on like a broader, wider audience who may not be as familiar with the more technical sort of aspects of poetry. But if they like it, if something resonates with them, that I always find like a good indication of whether it could be good enough, or at least interesting. Just at least be interesting. Doesn't have to be good, just be interesting, just be unique. That's it. Good is too subjective. Some people will think it's good, some people will think it's garbage. You can't please everyone. So just be happy with your own work. If you think that something is good enough for you, then it's good enough. That's it. You're the only indication. But I do find that sometimes it's good to just like pass it on to maybe like one or two more people, a confidant, someone you can trust, because also she's very good, because she'll say, Arch, this is garbage. Like, how dare you send this to me? You've wasted 30 seconds of my time. And I'll be like, that's fair, okay. And then I'll go back and do something else. So find somebody who can be honest. And the other thing I would say is, yeah, it's very hard to get published. I totally get that. There are so few literary agents out there, and only like one of them knows how to do poetry. Maybe we can talk about this afterward if you're like more interested in targeting someone specifically. But for example, what I would say is Faber and Faber are actually very, very good. They're one of the very few publishers who you are allowed to contact directly, because all the other websites are hostile to submissions, as I'm sure you know. Faber and Faber are very good. You can just spam them for as much as you want. Like I tried them like many, many times, and they were always very nice about it. But that sort of like the more practical step is that you will have to do a little bit more research. Also, I'm going to be honest with you, America, so much better. Go to America. Like, start sending your work to American literary agents, American publishers. They are so much more welcoming. Like, they want so much. Like, there are so many different sort of like walls and barriers to break down in England. It's a very snobby society, as I've learned, honestly, this country, my goodness. But America, great. Much more opportunities there. That's what I would recommend.
Nice. Do we have any more questions from the audience? Yeah? Do we want to just go at the front?
Hi.
Or we can get you after as well.
How do we protest our inability to meaningfully rebel freely? Or do we have very little to no autonomy over our own futures? And can we sort of transform that into our own writing and ideas to transform people's imaginaries and try and make a meaningful difference?
Oh, that's such a great question. And you're so right, because I'm so frustrated with my own inability to express myself fully. Like, my goodness, like, sorry, I'm so worked up about this.
You should be interviewing, not me.
It's an excellent question. A very, very good one, because, as I'm sure you know, there's been a lot of, Just Stop Oil protests in the news recently, and my goodness, and how the method of protest really splits people. Because what is the point of protesting? What is the point of organizing yourself if you're making zero difference? If somebody can just pass you by on the street, you haven't inconvenienced them in any kind of way. So, as you can tell, I just need to calm down, excuse me, just honestly. As you can tell, I don't have one particular good answer for this. I'm looking for it myself, honestly. If I think of a good answer, I'll like post it on Instagram or something. Like it's all very good organizing rallies and protests. So maybe you can get picked up by like some mainstream media publisher, like of course. But like how do you really make a difference? Step one, yes, you can spam your local MP, you can spam your local councils and sort of like hope that they can sort of like take that on as a cause. That is effective. It's much slower. Democracy is a very it's an ancient and noble beast, but it's very, very slow. I believe in democracy. I believe you can do it. I believe that you can be doing this without resorting to criminal means. I would never, like, I'm a pacifist. I would never condone any kind of violence. However, I believe that, like, if a government is doing something to curtail your freedoms, I think within existentialist ethics, it's actually justified to basically destroy government property if it is against the government that you are protesting, because that is a way you can make yourself heard if they've robbed you of your voice. But I don't advocate that now. I don't think we should be destroying government buildings. What we can do is we can sort of also make financial contributions and financial donations to great charities, like, for example, the Good Law Foundation, the Good Law Charity, the Good Law Foundation, something like that, where basically they're this incredible organization that specifically targets investigations into corruptions on high levels. So, for example, like, if I sell more art, I'm going to try and gather as much money as possible. So basically, I can fund the Good Law Society to just like investigate Matt Hancock, for example, because it's difficult for me to understand why government failings aren't being investigated, why there isn't proper scrutiny. I understand the COVID Commission is sort of like gathering at the moment. They're hearing evidence. I can't wait to see those results. But again, democracy is an achingly slow beast. We'll get there in the end, but it just takes a very long time. I understand what you mean about how we live in an instant society. We want change now, we want it 5 minutes ago. I don't have a good answer as to how we can basically all come together now and like make these changes. But on a larger scale, what we can do is we can make good choices. We can do our best. We can go into professions that we think will make a difference. We can go into government. We can go into we can go into research, we can go into sciences, we can make continuously good choices like all the time, and that does make a difference too. I mean, actually, in the 21st century society, this is like the most peaceful it's ever been, because and it's not by magic, and it's not by a miracle, and it's not by a change in human nature. It's because collectively people started making good choices. We're going towards justice, we're going towards democracy, we're going towards equality. And these choices matter. They matter so much because one person in one country can make one bad choice and invade Ukraine. Choices really matter. And we have to just keep making the right choices like throughout the majority of our lives. I know that's not a very good answer and it feels a bit long-term and tedious, but at the very least, we should all be doing that. And I'm going to think some more about protesting, because I'm very interested in that myself.
So we had a question at the back, and I think that has to be our last one, just because we are running slightly over.
Hi, so I missed the beginning, so forgive me if you already covered this, but I'm going to throw a lot at you, and you can choose whatever you want to address. But my main question is, how do you reconcile publishing your work on platforms like Instagram and also the issues that you talk about, such as algorithmic surveillance, consumption culture, et cetera, et cetera? Do you think like art belongs on platforms like Instagram? And my second part of this is, I suspect that you have a somewhat complicated relationship with the mainstream, since you do publish on social media platforms, and So I wanted to hear you talk a little bit about like who your art is meant for, if you think about it, if there are any considerations of how, like talking about mainstream things such as algorithmic surveillance, like bakes into your art. Thank you, and sorry for the long question.
No, great question. So the first part is about, just make sure I got it right, basically like if art belongs on Instagram and how I sort of reconcile being a very sort of online person with all these issues that I sort of rail against surveillance capitalism, etc. Also, Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, excellent book. Everyone please go read that as well. Terrific. To be honest, this is something that's always sort of come quite easy to me because I just post my work on Instagram, as you may know. It's literally just like, it's the most boring stuff because it's just a black and white image of text which the algorithms hate. And I love that because I don't give away my location. I don't I don't live stream. I actually feel very content with this because I don't feel like I expose myself too much. Like people rarely know what I look like, which is great. So I actually feel okay about that. I don't feel like I'm giving away too much information. And also the way I use social media, I wonder if I can show you. I wonder if I can show you right now what my Instagram looks like. So you know how when you click your explore page, mine is just pictures of corgis. That's the only thing my Instagram knows about me, is that I have a dog and it's a corgi. That's it. So I keep my activities to the bare minimum. I don't want them to know anything about me. But I do find it a very effective vehicle for my work. That's all I do. It's basically just my work or like work-related things. So I find that very useful because like everyone's on it. Everyone's on the platforms. Like, where do I know all these people from? We go to the same social media. That's how I know everyone. So I feel like it's, I wouldn't want to limit myself by not being active on at least one social media. And I am only active on one social media because I just don't have the attention span. I don't have TikTok. I don't trust China, as we know. So for example, like Facebook is exhausting. It's just, my goodness, all of Facebook posts are like, oh, look at this bird. I wish I could share this bird with my sister, but she's not talking to me right now. So just it's hectic. So I'm not a huge fan of that either. Twitter, oh my goodness. What's going on there? So I feel like I feel okay with my social activity because I'm only on one platform and I'm not even particularly interesting on it. And also it's the way I use it. Technology is never inherently evil. It's how you use it that counts. So I feel okay with my personal use of it. Your more direct question, does art belong on Instagram? Art belongs everywhere. Art belongs to everyone and art belongs everywhere. So all for it. Art belongs on bumper stickers, art belongs in the clouds, everywhere, all the time. If there's a space, use it for art, not entertainment. And your second question about the mainstream. I don't think of myself as particularly mainstream, to be honest. But again, it's how you position yourself within it as well. Like, so for example, like there are amazing things out there in art, in technology, in science, maybe even songs. Like there are incredible artists out there. There's great music out there. It's just not probably in the mainstream. However, it does certainly pay off if you do hit that lovely vein of mainstream and you can translate your art into commercial success, because actually, even though like I'm not that much of a hyper-capitalist myself, but you know what's great? When I can pay my bills and when I can afford to get my dog a garden, which he really enjoys because he has arthritis now, so he needs to go outside. It's very difficult. So so I'm actually, again, I would love to be more mainstream. However, I would always want to keep a certain part of, my own integrity. So I'd like to hit the mainstream with my work, with what I want to be writing, with what I want to be doing. Like, I would be very surprised if in 5 years' time I was there sort of writing poetry, trying to sort of like sell, lip gloss to teenagers or diet pills that give you diarrhea. I made bad choices if I find myself there in 5 years' time. I don't think it's something that I would do. So even if you are in the mainstream or if you're trying to get there, do it your way. There is always a way to create with integrity, to create authentically. Not to try and capture commercial success, not to try and entertain the male gaze or whatever have you. Like there's always a way to create with integrity. There's always a way to create authentically. Keep doing that. If you hit the mainstream, good for you, commercial success. If not, keep going, because the satisfaction of creating something that you want to do for yourself is already enough.
Amazing. Well, on that note, thank you so much for coming. This was incredibly insightful. I think we all learned a lot about existentialism, which is something I don't know much about, so it was very insightful. So thank you so much. Could we get one more round of applause for Arch Hades?